Hey guys, so we're going to be going over preliminary research processes part 2. And when I say preliminary research processes, just kind of to clarify, is the processes you use to initiate your research, the strategies that you can use to get your research off the ground the fastest and most effective way possible. So we're going to talk about using Wikipedia. We've already kind of talked about what you find like when you go to those first initial Google results. One of those is Wikipedia. And a lot of those sources are tertiary sources. So we're going to talk about what are some concerns about those and what are some ways to use those things in useful ways. So I'm going to explain first like what I mean by a tertiary source. Sometimes we'll call these especially tertiary sources like Wikipedia. And I use that as kind of my go-to example of what a tertiary source is because everybody's familiar with it. I'll sometimes call them a reference source or an overview source. They tend to be actually really good jumping off points, especially if you're trying to research an issue that you just don't know that much about. Like you're interested, maybe you've read a couple of things, but you're not that super well versed in it. And sometimes it's really even hard to figure out what you need to research if you don't have a base knowledge for it. You might not even be aware of the laws or important events or studies or things that have come out or happen that you need to go research. So it's hard to figure out what you don't know. Some of these sources, at the very least, can give you a good idea of what kinds of things are happening that you don't know about that you can go research from a more in-depth source. So what these things are typically like summaries, definitions, histories, like timelines. A lot of times when you go to these sites on Google and it's like the about page or the title is just like the issue and it's just like this overview of like basic information, like lists of facts, like just like those pages that have like bulleted point facts and statistics and things like that. Those are kind of considered tertiary. They tend to organize and gather information and sort of present information just as a laid out, almost like a reference list. They're not analyzing the issue. They're not commenting on it. They're not trying to go really in depth with things. They're just trying to give you just like a quick reference list or a quick overview. And a lot of times I'll say what these sources are there for is to help teach or kind of get you started. They tend to they'll provide sometimes really helpful basic overviews, quick facts and numbers you can look up and see where those came from. Sometimes even recommendations for more detailed sources. If you go to their list of references, a lot of these tertiary sources, they aren't providing new commentary. They're just gathering from a lot of different places. So a lot of times their reference list can be super helpful because there's a lot that they've gathered. So the next thing, I know this page is a little bit long. We're going to kind of walk through it a little bit. The publishing process kind of goes in one direction, while a lot of times as researchers we go backward in the opposite direction. And here's why. When things are being published, a primary source will often come out first. If you were researching things about 9/11, you might go back and see the original news clips that happened in the moment, interviews and images of things that were happening at that time, and that would be primary. They're the first-hand accounts in the moment of the thing you're looking up or the event that you're looking up. So if you're looking up things about 9/11, it would be these older sources that happened at the time. If you're looking up things with the current election, current debates, press conferences, really current news reporting about things happening. And news is a little bit tricky sometimes because it's kind of primary and secondary, but we'll get kind of more into that. Things that sort of show it taking place, from first-hand accounts. Sorry, words. People that are experiencing it in the moment. Those are your primary things that come out first. Secondary sources come out later. They typically pull from other secondary sources or those primary sources, build off of those and use them as commentary. So like after 9/11, people would, news would come out, again, it can be secondary, news would come out later, like after the fact, or articles would be written after the fact, and they would use those primary sources, those videos and interviews, live coverage, all of that. They would use that to help them produce commentary on the issue, and that's secondary. That's when you sort of start getting into the meat of the issue a little bit, where you do get that, like using sources to like analyze and comment and have a conversation. With tertiary sources, there's not usually a lot of conversation happening, because again, it's just the compiled like list or overview from a super objective standpoint. So it's not really offering anything new. It's there to gather after the fact. They tend to pull from primary and secondary and sometimes other tertiary sources. They just sort of compile data. So it usually can be kind of like a collection or lists of primary and secondary sources, like reference works. Like it usually is there to provide you a tool to make your research better, but often to point you to more in-depth sources, the secondary and the primary stuff. And those, it sort of comes out later. Like primary sources, if we're looking over here, like they occur first because they're in the moment. When you get here, secondary sources are next because they comment on the issue, like after the fact. They tend to analyze and pull from and illustrate with those primary sources, the first-hand accounts. Tertiary sources can come way after the fact because they're just gathering information mostly from secondary sources, and they're usually super removed from the issue. So they're reporting from a very kind of removed, faraway place. I'm going to move my video. So when we research, tertiary tends to come first because they teach or report in a more general sense. They help you get your feet off the ground, get your feet wet, get a sense of a lot of different things with the issue. Secondary and primary are the meat. Secondary is like your expert commentary and discussion. And then primary, gets us back to the moment. So a lot of times we'll say we start, if we don't know much about the issue, we're just getting started, we start at the tertiary stuff, the stuff that's reporting from a removed sense, because it's usually like general and very inclusive and objective, and it really gives us a sense of the whole conversation and a sense of some stuff we maybe just didn't know, and helps us kind of just get a general sense of what this issue is about. And from there, we move backward into the more in-depth stuff, into the commentary and the analysis and the scholarly voices and things like that, once we know a little bit about the issue. So while the publishing process goes forward, as researchers, we tend to work backward from general to more specific. So when you're thinking about primary sources, you might often see like interview speeches, like diaries, birth certificates, journal articles, a lot of times like government documents with like recent information or kind of in the moment information can be kind of primary sources as well. News that's like live coverage of something can also be that. Interviews, if it's an article, this is sometimes where it gets tricky. If it's an article talking about a press conference or an article talking about an interview, it's secondary. The actual interview, the actual press conference, like watching it yourself, reading the actual original interview yourself, that's primary. Commentary, any kind of article that comments on it later and like links you to it and uses it as a source is either secondary or tertiary. Okay, so the point is, again, the publishing process moves forward when researching. Again, we work backward because our knowledge kind of works backward. Like you have to start at the surface and then dig in as you learn more, I guess. It doesn't necessarily like work that way like if you're a scholar. Like it's if you know, like we work backwards if we're learning something about an issue. Experts are already experts. So like if you know nothing about the issue, you might not, like if you're already an expert in that field, you're ready to dive in with the scholarly stuff. If you don't know as much about the issue, it's not usually a good idea to go straight to the scholarly sources because they're going to use very disciplinary specific language. They're writing for to other scholars. So their assumption is that their audience already knows all this terminology, already has all this like basic knowledge, knows these terms, these books, these studies that they're referencing. And it can feel a little bit like you're reading another language if you haven't really gotten your feet under you with that issue yet. there's a lot of like dates and terms and laws and perspectives and a whole lot of other stuff that you would have to kind of learn first, and that's why we kind of work backward.